Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. When you're in the middle of an outbreak, wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And often, there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face.
And can you get some schmutz sort of staying inside there?
Of course, of course.
What do you think about face masks?
Well, it's important for folks to know that face masks are not recommended for the general public. There are two things people should know. Number one, if you wear a face mask and you're not wearing it properly, you're going to be more likely to touch your face, and you can actually increase your risk of getting a respiratory disease like coronavirus or flu.
Surgeon General doubles down and says masks increase virus risk. Take a look. Wearing one improperly can actually increase your risk of getting the disease. What the World Health Organization and the CDC have reaffirmed in the last few days is that they do not recommend the general public wear masks, says the Surgeon General. There was a study in 2015 looking at medical students, and medical students wearing surgical masks touch their faces on average 23 times. We know a major way that you can get respiratory diseases like coronavirus is by touching a surface and then touching your face. Masks also can give the wearer a false sense of security. And that's kind of what Fauci said too. He says it gives people a psychological idea that they're being protected. We'll come back to that in just a minute, because they're actually saying that's why we should do it now. But he says it gives you a false sense of security. You're touching it. You're increasing the risk of transmission. You can increase your risk of getting it by wearing a mask if you are not a healthcare provider. Folks who don't know how to wear them properly tend to touch their faces a lot, and these were medical students, and actually can increase the spread of coronavirus. So there you hear it and you see it too. People are touching them all the time. You see that. You probably do it yourself. I do when I have to wear them. The coronavirus that causes COVID-19, says this report on MSN, it can adhere to the outer layer of a face mask for a week, according to a study by researchers from the University of Hong Kong. So if surfaces are a mode of transmission, which they are, why would I put a surface right at my face, right? Dr. Jenny Harries, England's deputy chief medical officer, has warned that it was not a good idea for the public to wear face masks, as the virus can get trapped in the material and causes infection when the wearer breathes in. So that's another factor about how the masks actually increase transmission. But by using a mask, even if it doesn't do a lot, it moves the locus of control to you. They're talking psychology now, away from the virus. It gives the individual a greater sense of control in this otherwise not controlled situation. So Lynn Bufka, a clinical psychologist and senior director for practice, research, and policy at the American Psychological Association, says, even if experts are saying it's really not going to make a difference, a little part of people's brains is thinking, well, it's not going to hurt. Well, yes, it is. But anyway, maybe this is in people's brains. Maybe it'll cut my risk just a little bit. So it's worth it to wear a mask, she says. In that sense, wearing a mask is a superstitious behavior. So it moves the locus of control to us in this uncontrollable environment where we feel like we're victimized by this and we're in a state of anxiety. And so we can calm our anxiety, and it has a psychological benefit akin to that of a superstitious behavior. Masks have, that's what Dr. Fauci said in the clip we just played, a psychological benefit. Can you believe that's why we're all wearing these things? Unbelievable. And they have to perpetuate the psychological standard. Listen to this. They admit it's political theater is all they're doing.
Oh, no. So, Wendy, I'm going to take my mask off when I speak. So.
I will as well. I'm waiting so that we can do a little political theater.
Okay.
So that it's on camera.
We got to get it on camera. It was just like that Wisconsin government agency that said when you're doing your Zoom meetings, when you're doing conference calls, visual, you got to wear your mask even when you're in your house by yourself. We got to do our political theater. Got to get it on camera.
We don't generally recommend the wearing of masks in public by otherwise well individuals because it has not been up to now associated with any particular benefit. It does have benefits psychologically, socially, and there are social norms around that, and we don't criticise the wearing of masks and have not done so. But there is no specific evidence to suggest that the wearing of masks by the mass population has any particular benefit. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest the opposite in the misuse or wearing a mask properly or fitting it properly or taking it off and all the other risks that are otherwise associated with that.
It may have a psychological benefit. He said it again. Fauci said it. It's political theater. And we just keep on doing it. I mean, what's next? Are they going to convince us that like putting on a funny hat or something is actually helpful in preventing cancer or whatever? And then everybody wears the hat because it might reduce our risk of cancer because we believe it. It's superstitious behavior. Science, science, science. We are always lectured to about follow the science, obey the scientists. Well, there's a difference there, isn't there? There's a big difference between science and scientists many times. There's a vast divide and gap between those two. The impact of face mask usage on social distancing. So you can see the study, not just the Mail article. But they say here these effects were more pronounced among those people who believe that face masks are effective at preventing the spread of coronavirus. So the more somebody believed face masks are effective, the more comfortable they were socially getting close to one another. We know what the main vector is for transmission. It's close, confined spaces for prolonged periods of time, like living in your house together or spending in a small place, in a close, confined place for long periods of time with people outside of your family. And so there is some common sense with regard to distancing and closeness and if you're in a vulnerable population. So why are we wearing masks then if it's increasing the risk of putting vulnerable people too close to potential carriers? So this chart published by the CDC shows how well masks are working. I want you to look at those who often or always wear masks. They comprise 14.4% and 70.6% of the population of those who are hospitalized with symptoms. Let's add up 70.6% plus 14.4%. So that adds up to 85% of symptomatic adults, people with COVID-19 symptoms in the hospital. 85% of them were always or often wearing their masks. 15% were never or rarely or just sometimes wearing masks. Now let's compare those numbers with how many people wear masks in this country. Because when you compare those numbers with how many people are wearing the masks, you can see how effective or ineffective these masks are. This was a Pew Research poll that was done in both June and August. And it showed, you can zoom right in there and see that of all adults in June, 65% of Americans said that they wore a mask most or all of the time. By August, that had jumped to 85%. Now, the numbers we were just looking at previously here, in this chart from the CDC, this was from July. So in July, 85% of those who were sick with COVID-19 in the hospital were mask wearers. Well, what was the percentage or the proportion of the population wearing masks in July? We don't have the numbers exactly, but we know it's somewhere between 65 and 85. 65% in June, 85% in August. July is smack dab between the 2 months. Let's just call it 75% of the country was wearing masks in July, the month when 85% of the people with symptoms were mask wearers. So let that sink in for just a second. Let's flip it around. 25% of the country was not bothering to wear a mask very consistently in July. 25% was wearing a mask sometimes or rarely or never. 25%. 15% of those hospitalized were those who were not wearing their masks consistently. So you notice how that group is underrepresented in the symptomatic COVID-19 diseased people in hospitals. 85% of the population of those who were symptomatic were mask wearers. 75% of the population were mask wearers. So wearing a mask apparently correlates with an increased risk of symptoms from COVID-19. Boy, that sounds familiar from what the health authorities were saying earlier on in this saga. So I thought you'd find that to be quite instructive and interesting. Coronavirus infection rates were 50% lower in regions with indoor mask mandates, and a nationwide order issued in July could have lowered weekly cases by 40%, Canadian study suggests. So studies show that mask-wearing areas of the world have lower case numbers. So masks must be working. But wait a minute, we just looked at two studies, Israel and the United States, particularly the American example, because we know how many people were wearing them and how many people were contracting this disease and ending up in the hospital. And wearing a mask correlates with an increased risk of hospitalization. Being inconsistent with mask wearing correlates with a lower risk of hospitalization. So how is it possible that they look at regional studies and find cases increasing in places where you're not wearing masks as consistently and cases decreasing in places where you are wearing masks consistently? Well, these two studies, these two data sets are conflicting. There's no doubt about it. One of them has to be wrong. And I'll tell you which one is wrong. It's the one we went through the whole thing about false positives and how cases can be so quickly and easily faked, intentionally or unintentionally. And so whenever you hear cases, take that with a grain of salt. Hospitalizations is a hard factual evidence with person with symptoms. That's real. That's observable. How much genetic fragmentation is remaining in the samples of the PCR test after 40 amplifications and cycles of the test to zoom in on that material and find who knows what, and the 100% positive rates and all of that fraud and hoaxing happening with the cases, just not buying it. That's the bottom line. Which brings us to the randomized controlled trial concept, which is Tony Fauci's gold standard. It's the scientific community's gold standard. He explained you have to compare your intervention with something. In this case, the intervention is not a pharmaceutical, it's masks. So are there any randomized controlled trials on masks where you compare the efficacy of using masks with a controlled group, no intervention at all, no masks? In other words, masked versus no masks, use a population of people and compare the two and see if masks help reduce infection rates. Well, several randomized controlled trials have shown in the past no reduction at all in viral infection with the wearing of masks. And you might have wondered, well, why haven't they done all year a randomized controlled trial for masks and COVID-19? Because that previous slide of the 7 there, these were from flu and other viruses. Well, we've had all year to test masks. Why haven't they done a randomized controlled trial for masks and COVID-19? Well, maybe they benefit from the doubt. Maybe there's no incentive to publish a randomized controlled trial that show masks don't help to protect from COVID-19. But there actually was a study, a Danish study, 3,000 people wearing masks, 3,000 people not wearing masks. All of them spend 3 hours per day in public for 30 days. Pretty cool study, pretty objective, right? You would think that medical journals would be chomping at the bit to publish this. Well, Alex Berenson, a New York Times journalist, points out that a lead investigator on that Danish mask study, the only study that we know of that was a randomized controlled trial on COVID-19 and mask wearing, he was asked, when would it be published? When would your study be published? You saw here the abstract, the explanation of how they did their study. They're withholding the results till it gets published, of course. Well, the lead investigator on the Danish study, his answer was, well, our study will be published as soon as a journal is brave enough. So he says, if you think that means the study shows masks work, think again. Take a wild guess why they're not publishing the results of that study. It probably shows what? Again, every study on the subject has ever shown. There's a slide again with the 7, and there's more than that even. No reduction in viral infection when using masks as an intervention. As I was thinking about masks as a stoppage for coughing and sneezing, I'm like, who sneezes into a mask anyway? As soon as I started putting these things on back in May or whenever they were forcing you to do it, if I had allergies or whatever and I had to sneeze, I'm immediately pulling the mask down, sneezing into the arm because that's gross. I'm not going to sneeze into a mask. Nobody sneezes into a mask. So the mask is not useful or helpful in regard to stopping coughs and sneezes, which you're not going to do into your mask. You're going to pull down and glue into the sleeve like we all hopefully have been trained to do anyway. So under what circumstances would this one be helpful? Well, have you ever heard of a close talker? This is bad manners anyway, but if you are spitting into somebody's face, particularly somebody shorter than you, because you are a close talker, a loud talker, stop it, okay? It's never something good to do, and you also could share your illness with people. So how about instead of forcing everybody to wear masks to prevent the large droplets, we just make sure we're not spitting in somebody's face. Let's just practice good manners in general instead of totally reorienting the emotional intelligence of our children who will not see their teacher's face. And a baby born this year looks at all the human beings except maybe their family members and thinks a human face is a pair of eyes with a cloth covering it. I mean, this is so dystopian. We have no idea the psychological impact, and we're not even getting into the negative effects of the masks yet. It's just like, hey, maybe instead of going there and forcing and doing all of this craziness and dividing people and making it this coerced thing, let's just be like, okay, let's cough and sneeze into our sleeve. Let's not be close talkers, particularly somebody shorter than us. Have to have a little appropriate distance. That's hard for some cultures. I'm sometimes like, I'm from a Dutch Christian Reformed background, and we in Grand Rapids and where I grew up, we're not all up in each other's faces. And sometimes I'm at speaking appointments and people are getting up. You know, there's sociological studies on proximity of face to face, and I'm sometimes backing up a little bit, just my preference. But maybe it's a good preference in this context in which we live. So we're going to cross that one off as well, because these large droplets do not defy gravity. They do not jump into, random places. COVID-19 may be spread through particles in the air. Ah, yes, aerosolized particles, airborne, expelled when you breathe. And these particles do defy gravity, and this may be the primary mode of transmission of COVID-19. We've got clusters of person-to-person transmission happening indoors. No coughing, no sneezing, no large droplets being generated and splashed into people's face, said Dr. Lisa Brosseau, an aerosol specialist and research consultant at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. She said that in these scenarios, the most likely mode of transmission is inhalation of particles in the air. 6 feet is not going to mean very much, said Milton. Indoor air is still being stirred up by air conditioning systems and heat thermal plumes from people, lamps, and computer screens. This will keep aerosols much bigger than 5 microns floating around and carry them much farther than 6 feet. Even if it's just people talking and singing, nobody with explosive coughs. So it's just breathing, talking, regular emission of what comes out of my lungs. No explosions of anything, coughs or sneezes that go a certain number of feet, and droplets, large droplets, they fall to the ground. This is just talking about what comes out of your lungs as a living, breathing human. When you're in an enclosed space, this virus can transmit through that vector, through that mode of transmission. So that has some implications for people who are in vulnerable populations, people who are really wanting to be careful. You're really going to want to be careful because that's how this is spreading. We have just as much evidence for this as anything. SARS-CoV-2 remained viable in this study in aerosols throughout the duration of our experiment, 3 hours.
It's the safety video going viral. An Argentinian firefighter with a deodorant can, simulating a sneeze or cough. It's feared coronavirus could travel in the air, like deodorant does in aerosols. This demonstration showing most face masks are useless at trapping or blocking moisture, unless they're the N95 grade.
So you're seeing the implications of mask wearing for aerosolized particles. Yes, like Fauci said, a mask may protect against a droplet, like one of the kind that fall to the ground, the large droplets. That's not going to go through a mask, but air goes through a mask, or you wouldn't have what you're seeing here in this video. In fact, studies were done on this. A study published in April asked patients to cough into either surgical masks or cotton masks and found that neither effectively filtered SARS-CoV-2 during coughs by infected patients. Somebody put out a funny meme about it. They said, "I'm wearing a cloth mask to stop a virus. I'm installing a chain link fence to stop mosquitoes." That may be slight hyperbole, but not much, because 97% of viral particles in studies go right through the cloth mask. The study I just showed you, 97% of viral particles go right through the cloth mask. So that's pretty much settled in terms of aerosols. These masks do nothing. And this one too. This is what virologists wear to protect themselves from a virus. And then on the bottom, but don't worry, your bandana works too. A little humor making the point clearly. Leaking from the top, leaking through the mask. This was imagery from a propaganda piece pushing masks. And it shows it's going right up into the air, and it's going to be in the enclosed space that other people are in. There's no way around that. Masks cannot stop aerosolized particles. The mosquito analogy is a pretty good one. Bottom line, the third mode of transmission, as I said, masks do nothing to prevent the expelling of aerosolized particles through, around, above, and under the mask. You're still breathing out, and it's going into the air. And if you're a vulnerable person in an enclosed space, you want to work on that, see if lifestyle changes can help with that type 2 diabetes and that heart disease and that obesity issue, because I'll tell you that people say, well, you're not supposed to tell people to lose weight because that offends them. I'll tell you something. I'm not as worried as much about offending somebody's feelings as saving their life, because they could die of the flu. They could die of the heart disease. We really want to get our health in order, and not just to save our lives, but because you find more joy. You find more happiness, you find more energy, you find more emotional and mental balance and spiritual connection when you are healthier. So I do advocate for weight loss. How much weight could we have lost in our society since February if the health authorities would have come out, and instead of being like, we're going to rush to get a vaccine, we're going to lock you all down, we're going to put you indoors in enclosed spaces and not allow you outside in the sunshine, if they would have said, the biggest risk factor for this is obesity. And we really need to work on our caloric intake. Are we eating, high calorie dense, low nutrient dense foods, fatty foods from fast food and fried joints? And are we drinking pop and soda wherever you live, whatever you call that? That's the message we really should have had to help people who are dying. There are a lot of people dying of this. All hysteria agenda aside, how can we reach out and help people? Well, it's not forcing masks on everybody. That's doing nothing. But we really can help people if we don't have the mirage and the illusion and the superstition of masks.
99% of people that get the virus have no serious problem with the infection. Half are asymptomatic.
Well, repeat that percentage. I thought it was at least half. Half are asymptomatic.
Half are asymptomatic, and 98 or 99% have no serious illness from
so you might feel as though you have a cold, sniffles.
Well, or you have the flu, or it's a bad flu, and you stay home.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you're not going to go to the hospital. You're not going to die. And frankly, if you feel that it's risky to go into a restaurant, then don't go. If you're 75 and a diabetic with, heart disease and obese, and you're a high-risk person and you don't feel safe going into a restaurant, then don't go. No one's mandating anyone goes. But to set up a law or a restriction that is based on very, very weak science at best, and to say, okay, you must operate that way or you can't open your restaurant is really not science. It's a fear-based and sort of cherry picking of certain studies. It's very poor analysis. as I say many times, a lot of smart people are doing a lot of sloppy thinking.
Yes, sloppy thinking. That's putting it mildly. In fact, I guess you could say sloppy thinking is an oxymoron because they are not thinking. There is not thinking that is happening. We need to be thinkers, not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts and how we conduct ourselves in our own events, in our own churches. And we can't necessarily dictate what governments are going to do and restaurants are going to do and corporations are going to do, but we can make decisions for ourselves that are based on reason and science and logical thinking. The mask mandates are also predicated upon the assumption that asymptomatic spread is what is fueling an epidemic, which Tony Fauci said asymptomatic spread does not fuel epidemics. It is rare. The top epidemiologist at the World Health Organization said it is very rare. And so putting masks on healthy people who don't have symptoms is a non-starter to begin with, even if masks did work. And we just showed the 3 modes of transmission, and that masks do nothing to help, but only to hurt the situation through the touching of them and all of that. And why do we need to slow the spread anyway? We've already asked that question in the previous volume of CovidDystopia when we said, you know what, by slowing the spread, if we could, what all we're doing is lengthening the period of time that we're going to be struggling with this virus, and you develop immunity when you're exposed to it. So if we're slowing the pace at which people are getting exposed to it, then we're lengthening the time that the vulnerable need to shelter. And we're actually increasing the amount of deaths then due to mental health issues and other things we're going to look at in the session on Do Not Despair. It's like, hey, young, healthy, no underlying health conditions. Let's contribute to the team effort here and get some immunity going. And that's how you beat a virus. And so why not get a little exposure to it? And that sounds like reckless and dangerous and scary because this is the greatest, scourge upon humanity in history. So we've been told. But Dr. David DeRose, a respected medical person and natural health practitioner, said early on in this, he was ahead of the curve. I was not on board with him. I was like, what? Because I was looking at 3.4%. And the World Health Organization, they were saying that's the death rate and it's super contagious and infectious. We'll see how that propaganda got out there through communist China in the next session, or 2 sessions from now. But anyway, he said, Dr. DeRose said, it wouldn't hurt if you're young, if you're healthy, to get a little exposure to this and develop some immunity because we're all going to be probably exposed, 80% of us anyway. So that's a different approach. Dutch government will not advise public to wear masks. Now, why did the Netherlands say we're not going to require or advise the public to wear masks? The decision was announced by Minister for Medical Care Tamara van Ark after a review by the country's National Institute for Health. And she says, because from a medical perspective, there is no proven effectiveness of masks. The cabinet has decided that there will be no national obligation for wearing non-medical masks. We're not going to do the mask thing in the Netherlands because there's no evidence that it helps. Again, these masks are for blocking droplets that fall to the ground from the doctor spitting into the surgical patient's open wound, from the spray of bodily fluids into the surgeon's face. You get the idea. They're saying there is no protection from influenza when wearing these masks. And we've got randomized controlled trials. That's the gold standard here. And all of them show no help that the masks provide. Exercising with face masks may reduce available oxygen and increase air trapping, preventing substantial carbon dioxide exchange. The hypercapnic hypoxia may potentially increase acidic environment, cardiac overload, anaerobic metabolism, and renal overload, which may substantially aggravate the underlying pathology of established chronic diseases. Further, contrary to the earlier thought, no evidence exists to claim that face masks during exercise offer additional protection from the droplet transfer of the virus. So masks do nothing, but particularly when you're active, if you're working hard, you're needing more oxygen and you're not getting enough transfer of carbon dioxide to O2, and it can cause problems. So it is a significant thing to enter into the discussion. This was surgeons, 53 surgeons with a pulse oximeter and and post-operatively and pre-operatively when they're doing surgery, and they found pulse rates increased and available O2 in their bloodstream decreased. Oxygen decreased after the first hour when they were wearing them. And so there's a trade-off there. Do you want to wear it? Do you not want to wear it? But that's part of the equation. That's part of the issue. Wearing a mask increases CO2, leading to cognitive dysfunction. This study in 2008 found the very same thing. So keep that in the equation and ask, how is my body responding to that, and the length to which I do it, under what circumstances, what kind of mask, in what environments, with what level of exertion, and did God create Adam in the garden with a mask on his face? It's like we're made in the image of God. And so I go back to children, seeing the faces of parents, and I feel like that's even more significant than the O2 levels. But the health message matters on this level, on the social, emotional intelligence level, and on a serious level. When you think about mentions of superstition, that this is really just superstition, it takes me back to the Dark Ages, when there were times of superstitions that dominated people's thoughts, that oppressed their lives, that enabled and empowered a priest class. The high priests of the age of paganism, baptized paganism under the Romanist system during the Dark Ages, they were enabled to control, with a stranglehold on the minds of people, to control their behavior, to dictate their thoughts, their beliefs, their conscience, dictated by man. It was a whole hierarchy of power and superstitions that were dropped down and trickled down into the vulnerable and ignorant hearts of the unlearned, illiterate populations of Europe. Now, we've learned that history. But is it possible that now we see a new priest class with a whole nother set of superstitions? They've admitted it with the mask thing being just a superstition, just a psychological benefit. And I had the thought, if there's no reason and rational basis for so much of this response that we've been subjected to, and many of us have gotten on board with not knowing any better, but if there's no actual data, science, rational, logical basis for it, well, this is just a return to Dark Ages thinking, or lack of thinking, I guess we should call it. And it's an awful lot like a cult. You'll see the headline also in this volume of CovidDystopia. Lockdown zealots are behaving like cult members. And as you think about modern cults and how mind control was so easily brought to people in a way that disconnected their reason, it decoupled their frontal lobe from their thinking capacity, and you operate sheerly out of groupthink, sheerly out of fear and superstitions. And so is the white lab coat, the new high priest class, so to speak, of the modern age that we think we're so enlightened. We say, trust the scientists, but where's the science to back this up? We're going through this in this session. Is there actual scientific basis for this forced masking? And the reality is, it's superstition. And people sometimes ask me, Scott, what do you think about masks? Like, should we take a stand on this? And I have, to a great extent, been a conscientious objector for masks, and not being the conscience for somebody else, but my conscience was implicated in the fact that if I am perpetuating a cult mindset, a cult that is dangerous because it's bringing forced vaccination of a rush untested vaccine that who knows about the safety and effectiveness of it. We'll talk about that in CovidDystopia, but we're dealing with a curtailing of liberty and freedoms and the conscience and the individual, a temple of God of individuals that we've never seen before. And if I just kind of go along to get along and perpetuate the system with my limited influence, then I'm fueling a cult, a dangerous cult of the white lab coat modern high priests that are declaring what we shall believe and what we shall do. And as a father, I have to come in and say at some point, not in a way of rebellion or being a curmudgeon or being angry, but just it's my responsibility before God to obey God rather than man. And say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And for my children, it's not up to the state to dictate what goes in my children's bodies, what goes on my children's bodies, what goes in my children's minds. And so we've covered that sort of thing in Media on the Brain and in Schooled, but this is very much hitting home for parents who are protective of their children's development and knowing that you have sovereignty and autonomy in how that child is raised. And the state has no jurisdiction on matters of conscience, on how we deal with health matters.
You ever wondered how and why it is that so universally people can believe something that is so blatantly contrary to the truth? Have you ever wondered why? Let's just take the Sabbath Sunday controversy. It's not like it's confusing in the Bible. I mean, it's very clear. The seventh day, the first day, the seal of God, the mark of the beast. This is our mark. This is God's seal. It's very, very clear what day the Sabbath is. Yet 99% of Christianity has missed that. How is it that we miss things? How is it that people can become so deceived on something, and so many people? Well, there's two main reasons, two main answers to that question. I'm going to take you to a couple of sociological experiments that were done in the past century. One of them was called the Milgram experiment. The other was called the Solomon Asch experiment. And both of them will help us understand how people can come to this point where they believe something or do something that's so contrary to reason, that's so contrary to conscience, but they do it anyway. It's like, wow, how do we end up with that state of mind? Let's start with the Milgram experiment. In this experiment, you have the person in charge who's doing the experimenting. He gets a guinea pig to come in and play the role of a teacher. Now, he doesn't know that he's a guinea pig. And the teaching method is kind of curious that he uses, but he says, this is the method we're going to use for teaching. The experimenter is in charge of the teacher, and he presents himself very authoritatively. This is what we're going to be doing. There's a student on the other side of this wall. Do you see these wires here and these little devices you can tap? Our student will be learning through stimuli of pain. You're going to be exerting electric shocks upon the person when they get questions wrong. It's a new innovative way of learning, and it's very progressive and effective, and so your job is to be the teacher. If he gets a question wrong, I'll tell you what to do, and you go ahead and click that. And it's all in good hands. Trust us. So the teacher is told, he just got a question wrong. Go ahead and hit that electric shock. He needs to have a little bit of a buzz, and that'll help him learn how to do this properly. The person, there's no actual person getting shocked, by the way. This is all a little thing they've cooked up. But he thinks there's a person getting shocked. And he taps the button, and they play recordings of people like screaming in agony, and they continue to intensify it. You need to amp up the electrical quantity there. We need a stronger current. Okay, we're going to turn it up even more now. He keeps getting them wrong. Keep tapping it. It continues like this. They have recordings of guys like screaming, please stop, like just pleading for relief from the pain that is being endured. Why does this guy keep doing it? Because he's told to. Because the authoritative man has taken control of his ability to reason and think for himself. And it's not through some hypnotic thing. It's just through the principle of authority. Now, I believe in God's authority, and we want to appeal to biblical authority, but man's authority is far too often superseding any individual's ability to discern reality from fantasy, to discern right from wrong, to discern truth from error. The Milgram experiment showed the power of authority. Somebody's got a white lab coat on. Somebody's got a white lab coat on. Okay, I'll do whatever you say. The Solomon Asch experiment looked at this from a little bit different angle. In this experiment, Solomon Asch, the experimenter, brought 8 people in groups of 8. So he did this a number of times. And in every group there was the same experiment to get a number of these to see some numbers and data on this. In each group of 8 that came in, He deliberately had 7 people briefed and aware of the trick. The 8th person was unaware that he was the guinea pig. And he had these cards, and Solomon Asch says, we're going to hold up these 2 cards, like the ones you see there, and it's the easiest question imaginable, okay? Which line does the one match? Does it match A or B or C? Well, obviously, it matches C. Okay, so he came up with something basically as easy as possible to remove any error from the equation and make this simply a social experiment. 100% of people will get that right 100% of the time. Clearly, it's not A or B. It's one of these. Okay, it's C. So, but he tells the 7 people, here's what you're going to do. The first few rounds of this, answer it correctly. But then at round, I think it was round 4 or 5, start answering incorrectly. Answer this way, this way, this way, this way. So all 7 of them now are going to say the wrong answer, one after the other. And the 8th person is going to sit there. So it happens, and they go, let's say it's this card. This is the 5th round of this. They're like, man, what's the point of this? And well, the 8th person is going, okay, this is easy. But then he sees that card. And everybody in the line before him says, it's A, it's A, it's A. It's A. It's A, all the way down to the 7th person. And he's going, okay, clearly it's C, but everybody else has said it's A. This is kind of a weird dilemma, social dilemma here. A number of people would actually switch their answer intentionally in their mind and say, I know it's C, but I'm just going to say A to fit in. Other people, Solomon Asch said, were actually convinced in subsequent interviews that they were getting their answer right. In other words, the group answer changed their mind and their eyes began to play tricks on them. All told, 75% of number 8 people, remember they did a number of groups of 8, so he had quite a few number 8s. He interviewed them all. He watched all their answers. 75% of people will answer wrong at least some of the time when everybody in front of them has answered wrong. So when we talk about deception and when we talk about Babylon, we're talking about 2 things, authority and conformity. Authority. The Pope said it. He's the man who's in the place of God, and so we accept the church's law over God's. It's an appeal to authority. Or the pastor said it and he sounds like he knows what he's saying. Or my parents said it, or anything of the sort. Now, we believe in honoring our parents. We believe in having, godly authority in the church and structure and order in the church. But not over truth. God is the only final arbiter of truth, and he has expressed it in his word, and that's done. We don't contradict that with man's authority, right? Peter and John said in Acts 5, you judge for yourselves whether it is right that we obey God rather than men. They were not knuckled down by the authority. They would take a whipping and a beating to be able to continue to present the truth. But other people are swayed by conformity. This is what everybody else is doing. If I do something different, then I'll stick out. This is what everybody else believes. I'll believe what they believe, so I fit in. It's a social pressure that is probably even bigger than authoritative pressure in people's lives. We've got to break free from that. We've got to get over those, insecurities, because I might be weak and feel, but people are going to laugh at me or whatever if I accept this truth from the Bible, if I practice that truth from the Bible. We can't be one of those 75% of people that deliberately and knowingly answers wrong when we know what's right. And we certainly don't want to be mind controlled into it like some of them were. The Holy Spirit will give us victory over that deception. So letting an expert do our thinking for us, or letting the group do our thinking for us, dictating our conscience, is a sure way not only to be wrong, but to surrender our individuality, to surrender your very soul. So people have asked me, Scott, what is this thing about the Sabbath? I mean, there's just no way 99% of Christianity got this wrong. There's no way. Well, show where it's wrong from the Bible. There's just no way 99% got it wrong. That's the conformity, isn't it? That's exactly what Solomon Asch found. I've had people say that to me. A lot of times we don't ask the question why enough. It's a story of a bride, new wife. She said, I'm gonna cook a meal for my husband. I'm gonna do it just the way that I was raised doing it. And so she went to the store and she bought herself a roast, and she had the butcher cut off the end of the roast as she had learned to do with her mother. And she brought it home and cooked it, and her husband saw her doing this, and he said, "Honey, why'd you have the end cut off like that?" And she's like, "I don't know, Mom always did it that way." So they call up Mom. Mom, why do we cut the end off of the roast before we put it in the oven? She says, I don't know. Grandma always did it that way. My mother always did it that way. That's just how I learned to do it. So they call up Grandma. Grandma, why do we cut the ends off of the roast like this? They finally ask the question why after generations, and Grandma says, I don't know why you guys do it. I did it because my pan was too small. So the deception, if you will, the tradition carried on. It was not necessary for mother or granddaughter to do this, but they had never asked why until one inquisitive person asked, why? Babylon's deceptions. They are everywhere.